It was a quiet evening, and Daniel Green, a hard-working man in his late 30s, was driving home after a grueling day at his office job. His car, a modest but well-maintained sedan, cruised through the dimly lit suburban streets. The soft hum of the radio filled the cabin as Daniel reflected on the day, eager to get home to his family. He was a man who valued hard work and honesty, but tonight, his drive would take an unexpected and dangerous turn. As Daniel approached an intersection, he noticed flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. The unmistakable wail of a police siren followed. His stomach tightened, but he kept his composure. He pulled over to the side of the road, turning off the radio and lowering his window. Officer Bradley stepped out of the patrol car, his figure illuminated by the harsh beams of his headlights. Bradley was a veteran cop with a reputation that few spoke about openly, but many knew of. He had a long history of targeting minorities under the guise of routine stops, often planting evidence to justify arrests. To the untrained eye, he seemed like just another officer doing his duty, but to those who'd encountered him, he was a predator. Daniel kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, a habit ingrained in him after years of knowing how quickly situations like this could escalate. Bradley approached the driver's side with a flashlight, his expression unreadable, but his tone laced with authority. "License and registration," Bradley barked. Daniel calmly complied, handing over his documents. "What's the issue, officer?" he asked, his voice steady but respectful. "Your tail light's out," Bradley replied curtly. Daniel glanced in the mirror. He knew that wasn't true, he had checked his lights just a few days ago. But he said nothing, aware that arguing could make matters worse. Instead, he nodded and waited patiently. Bradley took his time examining Daniel's paperwork, though it was clear everything was in order. After a few minutes, he handed it back and said, "Step out of the car." "Why? Is there something wrong?" Daniel asked, his brow furrowing slightly. "Step out of the car," Bradley repeated, his tone firm. Daniel hesitated but complied, opening the door and stepping onto the pavement. The air was cool, and the street was eerily quiet. Bradley motioned for Daniel to stand by the front of his car. "I'm going to search your vehicle," Bradley said without explanation. "Do you have probable cause?" Daniel asked, trying to remain calm. "Don't play lawyer with me," Bradley snapped, his tone growing more aggressive. "Just stay where you are." Unbeknownst to Bradley, Daniel's car was outfitted with hidden recording devices. For months, Daniel had been working as part of a federal investigation into police corruption. His vehicle was equipped with a dashcam that captured video and audio, recording every word, every action, and every moment of this encounter. He remained outwardly compliant, knowing that every second of this interaction was being documented. Bradley began rummaging through the car, opening compartments and searching under seats. His movements were methodical, but Daniel noticed something unusual. The officer seemed to be fumbling with something in his pocket, a small bag that he quickly slipped into the glove compartment. After a few minutes, Bradley emerged from the car, holding up a plastic bag filled with what appeared to be narcotics. Well, Bradley said, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "Looks like we've got a little problem here." Daniel's heart raced, but his expression remained calm. "That's not mine," he said firmly. "Of course, it isn't," Bradley sneered, pulling out his handcuffs. "Turn around. You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute." Daniel complied, allowing himself to be cuffed without resistance. His mind raced, not with fear, but with a quiet confidence. He knew the truth was on his side, and he had the evidence to prove it. As Bradley led Daniel to the patrol car, Daniel caught the faint red light blinking on his dashboard, the signal that the recording devices were active and capturing everything. He suppressed a small smile, knowing that the very act Bradley believed would ruin his life was about to expose the officer for who he truly was. For Bradley, this was just another routine stop, another easy arrest to pad his record. But for Daniel, this was the beginning of the end for a corrupt system. He had played his part perfectly, and the evidence he carried was about to shake the foundation of everything Bradley thought he controlled. As Officer Bradley sat smugly in his patrol car, filling out the arrest paperwork, Daniel sat silently in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him. To anyone observing, he appeared calm, too calm for someone who had just been accused of a serious crime. But beneath his composed exterior, Daniel was not just a man falsely accused. He was a man with a mission. Months earlier, Daniel had been recruited by a federal agency to assist in a high-stakes investigation into widespread corruption within the local police department. The agency had received numerous complaints from residents about officers abusing their power, targeting minorities, and planting evidence to secure arrests. Officer Bradley's name had come up repeatedly, a recurring figure in these troubling reports. But corruption this deep couldn't be dismantled without hard proof, and that's where Daniel came in. Daniel, a former investigative journalist with a sharp mind and an unshakable sense of justice, had volunteered for the risky assignment. He had grown up in this city and knew firsthand the impact of unchecked corruption. The opportunity to bring about real change was too important to pass up, even if it meant putting himself in harm's way. His car was no ordinary sedan. It had been outfitted with state-of-the-art surveillance equipment by the federal agency. A discreet dashcam captured crystal-clear video of everything that happened in front of the car, while hidden cameras inside the cabin recorded multiple angles. High-quality microphones picked up even the faintest whispers, ensuring that no word or sound went unnoticed. The equipment was designed to be undetectable, seamlessly integrated into the car's interior. From the moment Bradley had pulled him over, every second of the encounter had been recorded. The camera captured the officer's aggressive demeanor, his baseless demand to search the car, and, most importantly, the moment he slipped the small bag of drugs into the glove compartment. The audio recording was just as damning, picking up Bradley's sarcastic comments and his complete lack of justification for the stop. Sitting in the back of the patrol car, Daniel reviewed the events in his mind. He had played his role perfectly, calm, compliant, and unthreatening. He knew that reacting emotionally or resisting would only complicate matters. Instead, he allowed Bradley to dig his own grave, knowing that the evidence gathered during this stop would be the key to exposing not just Bradley, but an entire network of corruption. Meanwhile, miles away, federal agents were monitoring everything in real time. The car's surveillance system was linked to a secure feed, allowing the team to watch and listen as the encounter unfolded. They had already seen Bradley plant the drugs, and their excitement grew as they realized they finally had the smoking gun they needed. Back in the patrol car, Bradley turned to Daniel with a smug grin. "You thought you could get away with this, didn't you?" he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Daniel met his gaze through the rearview mirror, his expression neutral. "I'm sure the truth will come out," he replied calmly. Bradley chuckled. "Yeah, the truth is you're going to jail for a long time." Daniel didn't respond. He knew better than to engage. Instead, he let his mind focus on what was to come. The federal team would act quickly, ensuring that the evidence from the recording devices was preserved and prepared for court. This wasn't just about him, it was about dismantling a system that had preyed on vulnerable communities for far too long. As the patrol car pulled into the station, Daniel allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. He had played his part, and the trap had been set. Bradley, unaware of the recording devices and the federal agents watching his every move, had walked straight into it. When Bradley opened the door and escorted Daniel into the precinct, he did so with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. But Daniel knew better. He knew that the very system Bradley had abused was about to catch up with him. For now, Daniel would play along, knowing that the truth was on his side, and that justice was only a matter of time. The patrol car pulled into the precinct parking lot, its flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the gray concrete walls. Officer Bradley exited the car with an air of smug confidence, dragging Daniel out of the back seat. To Bradley, this was just another successful bust, another addition to his already inflated record of arrests. But he had no idea that this moment would be the beginning of his downfall. As they entered the station, other officers glanced their way. Bradley's reputation preceded him, some admired his high arrest numbers, while others whispered about his questionable methods. Daniel, handcuffed and calm, kept his gaze steady, taking in the room. He wasn't just a man under arrest, he was a man gathering intel, observing the dynamics of a department rife with corruption. Bradley led him to an interrogation room, a stark, windowless space with a single table and 2 chairs. "Take a seat," Bradley ordered, shoving Daniel into the chair with unnecessary force. Daniel complied without protest, his expression unreadable. Bradley leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his posture oozing arrogance. "So, let's talk about the drugs I found in your car," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "They're not mine," Daniel said simply, meeting Bradley's gaze. Bradley laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "That's what they all say." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his calm demeanor unshaken. "It's the truth. But I guess the evidence will speak for itself." Bradley narrowed his eyes. There was something unsettling about Daniel's composure. Most people in his position would be panicking, protesting their innocence, or begging for leniency. But Daniel was different, calm, deliberate, and almost confident. It put Bradley on edge, though he didn't show it. "Let me save you some trouble," Bradley said, pulling out a folder. "You're looking at possession with intent to distribute. That's serious time, years in prison. So, if you want to make this easier on yourself, now's the time to talk." Daniel smiled faintly. "I think I'll wait for my lawyer." Bradley's jaw tightened. "Suit yourself," he said, slamming the folder onto the table. "But trust me, you're not getting out of this." What Bradley didn't know was that every word he spoke was being recorded in high-definition audio, fed directly to a secure location where federal agents were monitoring the live feed. In a nondescript office miles away, the team of agents watched intently, their screens displaying multiple angles of the interrogation room, along with timestamps and audio levels. They had been following Bradley for months, collecting evidence of his corrupt practices, but tonight's events had given them the smoking gun they needed. "Did you see that?" one of the agents said, pointing to the screen. "He's trying to intimidate the suspect." "Classic Bradley." "And we've got the whole thing," another agent replied. "The traffic stop, the planted evidence, and now this. It's airtight." Their supervisor, Agent Harper, stood behind them, her arms crossed as she observed the footage. "This is it," she said firmly. "We've been waiting for a moment like this. Start preparing the warrants. I want everything ready to go by morning." Back at the precinct, Bradley's interrogation continued. He paced the room, trying to rattle Daniel, but Daniel remained unfazed. In fact, he began dropping subtle hints, calculated phrases, designed to unsettle the officer. "You know," Daniel said, his tone casual, "it's funny how things work out. Sometimes the truth has a way of coming to light, even when people go to great lengths to hide it." Bradley froze mid-step, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" Daniel shrugged. "Nothing specific. Just an observation." Bradley stared at him, trying to decipher his meaning. There was something about Daniel that didn't add up. He wasn't acting like a man who'd just been caught with drugs in his car. He wasn't scared, defensive, or angry. If anything, he seemed amused. "Enough games," Bradley snapped. "You think this is a joke?" "No, officer," Daniel replied calmly. "I think this is serious business. And I think the people watching would agree." Bradley's brow furrowed. "What people?" Daniel didn't answer, letting the question hang in the air. The silence was deafening, and for the first time, Bradley felt a flicker of doubt. Was he being watched? Was there something he didn't know? In the surveillance room, the agents exchanged knowing glances. "He's good," one of them said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Textbook," Agent Harper agreed. "He's keeping his cool and putting just enough pressure on Bradley to make him second-guess himself." As the hours ticked by, the tension in the precinct grew. Word of Daniel's arrest had spread, and whispers began circulating among the officers. Some were curious about the calm, composed man sitting in the interrogation room. Others, especially those who had worked with Bradley, began to feel uneasy. They knew his methods and feared that tonight's arrest might bring unwelcome scrutiny. Meanwhile, the federal team worked through the night, finalizing their case. By dawn, they had compiled a mountain of evidence, the video and audio recordings from Daniel's car, corroborating witness statements, and a detailed timeline of Bradley's prior misconduct. The stage was set for a takedown that would shake the precinct to its core. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the city, federal agents prepared to make their move. Bradley, still unaware of the storm heading his way, walked out of the interrogation room, convinced he had successfully framed another victim. But his confidence was misplaced. The truth was no longer buried, it was about to explode into the open, bringing with it the justice that Daniel and countless others had long awaited. The morning light filtered through the windows of the precinct as officers shuffled through the halls, sipping coffee and preparing for another day on the job. For most, it seemed like any other day. But for Officer Bradley, the tide was about to turn in a way he never saw coming. At precisely 9 a.m., a convoy of unmarked black SUVs pulled into the precinct parking lot. Federal agents in crisp suits stepped out, their expressions a blend of determination and authority. At the head of the group was Agent Harper, the lead investigator who had orchestrated the entire operation. Her team carried briefcases filled with evidence and a stack of freshly issued arrest warrants. The officers inside the precinct barely had time to react before the agents entered the building, their presence immediately commanding attention. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and all eyes turned toward the team as they moved with purpose through the hallways. Bradley, seated at his desk with a cup of coffee, glanced up at the commotion. His initial reaction was one of mild curiosity, but as the agents approached his desk, a flicker of unease crossed his face. Agent Harper stepped forward, her sharp gaze locking onto him. "Officer Bradley," she said, her voice firm but controlled. "We need to speak with you." Bradley leaned back in his chair, forcing a smirk to mask his growing discomfort. "What's this about?" he asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Agent Harper placed a folder on his desk and flipped it open, revealing a series of high-resolution photographs and printed transcripts. "This is about your actions during a traffic stop last night," she replied. "Specifically, the drugs you planted in Daniel Green's vehicle." Bradley's smirk faltered. He glanced down at the photos, recognizing the unmistakable images captured by Daniel's hidden cameras. The evidence was damning, a clear shot of him slipping a bag of drugs into the glove compartment, accompanied by audio recordings that captured every word he'd spoken during the encounter. "This is ridiculous," Bradley said, his voice rising. "That man's a criminal. I did my job." Agent Harper raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by his protest. "Your job," she repeated. "Your job is to uphold the law, not break it. What you did was a blatant abuse of power, and we have the evidence to prove it." Bradley's colleagues began to gather, drawn by the escalating confrontation. Whispers rippled through the crowd as they realized what was happening. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others watched in stunned silence. Bradley had always been a divisive figure in the department, admired by some for his high arrest numbers but quietly questioned by others who suspected his methods weren't entirely clean. "You think you can come in here and accuse me of something without proof?" Bradley snapped, his confidence starting to crack. Agent Harper didn't flinch. She reached into the folder and pulled out a USB drive. "This contains the full video and audio recordings from Mr. Green's vehicle," she said. "We've reviewed every second, and it's all here, the moment you planted the drugs, the threats you made, and your attempts to intimidate him into submission." Bradley's face turned pale as the weight of the evidence hit him. He opened his mouth to speak, but found himself at a loss for words. "And that's not all," Harper continued. "Over the past 6 months, we've been investigating multiple complaints against you. This isn't an isolated incident, Officer Bradley. We have testimony from other victims, corroborated by additional evidence that points to a pattern of misconduct, racial profiling, planting evidence, and falsifying reports." As Harper spoke, her team began distributing documents to the precinct's leadership. The pile of evidence was overwhelming, detailing not only Bradley's actions but also implicating other officers who had either participated in or turned a blind eye to his behavior. The corruption extended deeper than anyone had anticipated, revealing a network of officers who had been exploiting their power for years. One of Bradley's closest allies, Officer Sanchez, tried to interject. "You can't just come in here and accuse us like this," he said, his voice defensive. "We've done nothing wrong." Harper turned to him with a steely gaze. "Officer Sanchez, we have evidence that you assisted Bradley in multiple incidents, including falsifying arrest reports and coercing witnesses. Your name is on this warrant as well." The room fell into stunned silence. Officers who had once stood confidently now looked uneasy, their alliances unraveling in the face of irrefutable evidence. Some tried to distance themselves from the implicated officers, while others quietly slipped away, hoping to avoid the fallout. Bradley, realizing the noose was tightening, made one last desperate attempt to deny the accusations. "This is a setup," he shouted. "That man, Daniel Green, he's lying. He's trying to take me down." Agent Harper leaned in, her voice cold and precise. "Mr. Green is working with us as part of a federal investigation. Every action you took last night was recorded and monitored in real time. You didn't just target the wrong man, Officer Bradley, you targeted the one man who was ready for you." Bradley's bravado crumbled. His shoulders slumped, and the room seemed to close in around him. The agents placed him in handcuffs, reading him his rights as he stared blankly ahead. Around him, the precinct buzzed with a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. As Bradley was led out of the building, Agent Harper addressed the gathered officers. "This department has been under scrutiny for months," she said. "Our investigation isn't over. If you have information about misconduct or corruption, now is the time to come forward. Change starts here." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Some officers nodded, while others avoided her gaze. The arrest of Bradley and his accomplices was only the beginning. The department would face a reckoning, and those who had turned a blind eye to corruption would no longer have the luxury of silence. For Daniel, watching from a secure location, the moment was bittersweet. Justice was being served, but the fight was far from over. He knew this takedown was just one step in a larger battle for accountability and fairness. As the federal agents left the precinct with their evidence and suspects in tow, a new chapter began, a chapter where corruption would no longer go unchecked and where voices like Daniel's would no longer be silenced. The fallout from the federal sting operation reverberated far and wide. Officer Bradley, once untouchable within the precinct, now sat in a jail cell, stripped of his badge and uniform. The charges against him were extensive: tampering with evidence, racial profiling, falsifying reports, and multiple counts of civil rights violations. Alongside him, several other officers who had either aided his corrupt schemes or turned a blind eye to his actions were also arrested and charged. The once proud precinct now faced a reckoning it could no longer avoid. The media quickly caught wind of the arrests, and the story dominated headlines. News outlets exposed the depth of the corruption, revealing a culture of abuse that had gone unchecked for years. Officer Bradley became the face of the scandal, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong within the department. But amidst the outrage and calls for accountability, one name stood out as a beacon of hope: Daniel Green. When the federal agency publicly acknowledged Daniel's role in the operation, the city's perception of him shifted dramatically. Initially labeled a criminal during his arrest, Daniel was now recognized as the brave individual who had put his own safety on the line to bring justice to a broken system. His story captured the hearts of many, becoming a rallying cry for change. At a press conference held by the federal agency, Daniel stood alongside Agent Harper, his calm composure once again on display. Cameras flashed as journalists peppered him with questions about his experience and motivations. Daniel, never one for the spotlight, spoke humbly. "I didn't do this for recognition," he began, his voice steady. "I did this because too many people in our community have been hurt by a system that's supposed to protect us. I knew I had a chance to make a difference, and I couldn't walk away from that." The crowd erupted in applause, and Daniel's words spread like wildfire. Social media lit up with messages of support, and activists began organizing around his story. Daniel quickly became a symbol of resilience and courage, proof that one person could indeed stand up against injustice and create real change. Meanwhile, the police department underwent a massive overhaul. The scandal forced city officials to take immediate action. Several high-ranking officers resigned, while others were fired for their complicity. A new chief of police was brought in, someone with a proven track record of integrity and reform. Policies were rewritten, and mandatory training programs on ethics and bias were implemented. A civilian oversight board was also established, giving the community a voice in holding the department accountable. For Daniel, the journey didn't end with the arrests. He continued to work closely with the federal agency, sharing his insights and helping to develop strategies for preventing future abuses. He also began speaking at community events, schools, and forums, using his story to inspire others. His message was clear: standing up against injustice isn't easy, but it's necessary. One evening, Daniel returned to the neighborhood where he had grown up. Walking through the streets, he reflected on how far he had come. He thought about the countless nights he had spent preparing for the operation, the risks he had taken, and the fear he had faced. But most of all, he thought about the people who had been hurt by the system, the ones whose stories had fueled his determination. As he sat on a bench overlooking the park where he used to play as a child, an older man approached him. "You're Daniel Green, aren't you?" the man asked, his voice filled with admiration. Daniel nodded. "That's me." The man extended his hand. "I just want to thank you. What you did, it gave people like me hope. My son, he was one of the people they targeted. He didn't deserve what happened to him. But because of you, maybe no one else will have to go through that." Daniel shook the man's hand, his heart heavy with emotion. "That's all I ever wanted," he said quietly. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the city, Daniel felt a deep sense of peace. The road had been long and filled with challenges, but it had all been worth it. He had made a difference, not just for himself, but for countless others who would benefit from the changes his actions had set in motion. In the weeks and months that followed, the city began to heal. Trust in the police department was slowly rebuilt, and community leaders worked hand in hand with law enforcement to create a more just and equitable system. Daniel's work served as a catalyst for these changes, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, justice could prevail. As Daniel looked to the future, he knew the fight wasn't over. There were still battles to be fought, still systems to be reformed. But for now, he allowed himself to take a breath, knowing that his actions had left an indelible mark, a legacy of justice and redemption that would endure for generations to come.